The champagne was warm, the smiles were plastic, and Sloane's jaw ached from playing the perfect sister. Paige's wedding was the social event of the decade, a glittering display of their father's bought and paid for influence. Sloane just wanted to slip out the back. Then the heavy mahogany doors of the banquet hall slammed open. The string quartet screeched to a halt. The man who walked in ignored the terrified groom and the gasping bride. He walked straight through the crowd, stopped in front of Sloane, and uttered a single word. Mine. The corset of the bridesmaid dress felt like a cage, constructed of sea-foam green polyester and familial obligation. Sloane tugged at the boning digging into her lower ribs, her eyes scanning the grand ballroom of the Belmont Hotel. It was a sea of crystal chandeliers, imported white orchids that smelled faintly of vanilla and death, and 400 of the city's most affluent, deceitful people. At the center of it all stood Paige, the bride. Paige was radiant, naturally. She wore a custom silk gown that cost more than the average starter home, laughing into the collar of her new husband, Carter. Carter had the kind of aggressive jawline and perfectly capped teeth that screamed generational wealth and a profound lack of inner monologue. They looked like a cake topper come to life. Perfect. Hollow. Sloane took a sip of her champagne. It was too sweet. Smile, Sloane. You look like you're attending a wake. The voice belonged to Richard, her father. He didn't look at her when he spoke. His eyes were busy tracking the room, cataloguing who was talking to the governor and who was avoiding the district attorney. Richard was a man who measured his worth in handshakes and offshore accounts. I am smiling, Dad, Sloane said, her lips curving into a practiced, empty crescent. It's my sister's wedding. I'm overflowing with joy. Richard finally turned to her, his expression tightening. He adjusted his silk tie, the diamond tie tack catching the light. Don't ruin tonight with your usual brooding. The senator is at table 4. I need this merger to go through, and I need the family looking unified. That means you stand there, you look pretty, and you don't say anything cynical. Unified, Sloane repeated. Right. She was the shadow to Paige's son. Paige was the golden child, the obedient daughter who married the right man from the right family. Sloane was the mistake who preferred old bookstores to country clubs, who worked a quiet job archiving city records instead of sitting on charity boards. She was tolerated, trotted out for photographs, and swiftly pushed back into the periphery. Just until the cake is cut, Richard muttered, patting her shoulder in a gesture that looked paternal from a distance, but felt like a threat up close. He walked away to intercept a state judge. Sloane retreated towards the edges of the room, her back hitting the cool, silk-lined wallpaper. She'd watched the crowd, the forced laughter, the calculating stares over the rims of crystal flutes. It was an exhausting performance, and she was so tired of pretending she belonged in it. She caught Carter's eye across the dance floor. The groom gave her a slick, knowing wink before turning back to a bridesmaid who was laughing a little too hard at his jokes. Sloane felt a familiar knot of disgust tighten in her stomach. Paige knew Carter wasn't faithful. Richard knew too. But the merger between Carter's real estate empire and Richard's logistics company was too lucrative to be derailed by something as trivial as infidelity. Just until the cake is cut, Sloane reminded herself. She set her half-empty glass on a passing waiter's tray and mentally calculated how long it would take to walk back to her apartment in heels. A sudden, sharp draft of cold air swept through the stifling ballroom. It wasn't a gentle breeze. It was the heavy, jarring chill of November cutting through a heated room. Someone had opened the main doors. Sloane looked toward the entrance, expecting late guests or perhaps a drunken uncle making a scene. Instead, she saw a wall of black fabric. 5 men stepped into the ballroom. They didn't move like wedding guests. They moved with the synchronized, fluid grace of predators entering an enclosure. They wore dark, impeccably tailored suits that hid the distinct bulges near their ribs. The low hum of polite conversation began to falter, rippling outward from the doors until the ballroom descended into a suffocating, unnatural silence. Even the string quartet in the corner slowed their playing, the cellist's bow hovering above the strings as the music died completely. Then the crowd parted. They didn't just step aside, they recoiled, pulling their silk gowns and tuxedo jackets away, as if the man walking through the center of the room carried a plague. He didn't rush. His pace was agonizingly deliberate, his leather shoes making no sound on the polished parquet floor. Sloane held her breath. He was tall, a few inches over 6 feet, with shoulders that filled out his midnight blue suit in a way that commanded immediate physical respect. His hair was dark, swept back but messy, as if he'd just run a hand through it in frustration. But it was his eyes that pinned the room to the walls. They were a flat, glacial gray. Dead, yet hyper-aware. Dante Valenti. Sloane didn't move in his circles, but she lived in this city. Everyone knew the name. The Valenti family didn't own politicians, they owned the dirt the politicians were buried in. Dante had taken over the syndicate 3 years ago after his father's sudden, violent passing. The streets had run red for a month, and then total, terrifying quiet. What was he doing at a high society wedding? Richard stepped forward, blocking the aisle. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving his spray tan looking sickly and orange. His hands shook. "Mr. Valenti," Richard forced out, his voice a pathetic, reedy squeak compared to his usual booming authority. This is a private event, my daughter's wedding." Dante didn't stop. He didn't even acknowledge Richard's presence until he was less than 2 feet away. The older man visibly shrank. "Richard," Dante said. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of anger, which somehow made it infinitely worse. It was the voice of a man who never had to raise it to get what he wanted. "You didn't answer my calls on Tuesday." We were preparing for the ceremony," Richard stammered, holding his hands up placatingly. "The logistics, the catering. I told your associates I would have the rest of the funds by the end of the quarter. The docks are running behind, the unions are—" "I didn't come for the docks." Dante cut him off. He didn't look at Richard. His glacial eyes swept over the room, dismissing the trembling guests, the weeping bride, the paralyzed groom. His gaze snapped to the corner of the room. It landed on Sloane. The breath punched out of her lungs. She froze, pinned to the silk wallpaper like a butterfly on a corkboard. The gray of his eyes was an ocean of ice, and she was drowning in it from 50 feet away. Dante bypassed Richard entirely. He walked past Paige, who let out a quiet, terrified sob, and past Carter, who was staring at his shoes. He walked the length of the dance floor, straight toward the shadows where Sloane was hiding. The room watched in absolute, morbid fascination. Sloane's mind screamed at her to run, to slip through the side doors leading to the kitchens, but her legs refused to cooperate. She felt the sudden, desperate urge to cover her bare shoulders, suddenly intensely aware of her own vulnerability. Dante stopped inches from her. Up close, he smelled of bergamot, cold rain, and something metallic. Gunpowder. Blood. She couldn't tell. A small, jagged scar cut through his left eyebrow, marring an otherwise brutally handsome face. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. He reached out. Sloane flinched, closing her eyes, expecting violence. Instead, the backs of his warm, rough knuckles brushed against her cheek. The touch was impossibly light, a phantom graze that sent a violent shiver down her spine. "Mine," Dante said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a request. It was a statement of indisputable fact. Sloane's eyes snapped open. "Excuse me?" she whispered, her voice shaking despite her desperate attempt to keep it steady. Dante didn't look away from her, but he addressed the room. "The debt is settled, Richard. The slate is clean." Richard pushed his way through the stunned crowd, his face pale and sweating. "Valenti, please. Take the Belmont property. Take the shipping routes on the east side. You can't take Paige. She's just been married. The scandal! Dante slowly turned his head to look at Richard. A terrifying, hollow silence stretched between them. Did I say I wanted the bride? Richard blinked, confusion momentarily overtaking his terror. He looked at Paige, then followed Dante's gaze back to Sloane. Understanding dawned on Richard's face, followed rapidly by something that made Sloane's stomach violently heave. Relief. Sloane? Richard whispered. The tension bled out of his shoulders. He didn't look at his youngest daughter with pity or fear. He looked at her like a spreadsheet that had finally balanced. No, Sloane said, her voice finding its volume. She stepped away from Dante, shaking her head. No. Oh, Dad, what is he talking about? What debt? Richard wouldn't meet her eyes. He stared at the floor. Sloane, please, just do as the man says. The betrayal was immediate and absolute. It shouldn't have surprised her. Sloane had spent 24 years learning exactly where she ranked in the Hayes family hierarchy. Yet the sheer speed with which her father threw her to the wolves stole her breath. You sold me, she asked, the words scraping out of her throat. It's not selling, Richard muttered, still avoiding her gaze, wringing his hands together. It's an arrangement. For the family, Sloane. If I don't settle this, he takes the company. He takes everything. Carter's family will pull out of the merger. We'll be ruined. So ruin us! She snapped, a sudden unfamiliar rage flaring in her chest. She looked at Paige. Her beautiful, perfect sister was clutching Carter's arm, tears streaking her flawless makeup. But Paige wasn't stepping forward. Paige wasn't screaming for them to stop. She was hiding. They were all perfectly fine with this. As long as the music kept playing, as long as the champagne kept flowing, they would gladly watch her get dragged into the dark. Sloane felt a large, warm hand wrap around her upper arm. It wasn't brutal, but the grip was unbreakable. We're leaving, Dante said. She turned to him, the anger masking her terror for a fleeting second. I'm not going anywhere with you. I am a human being, not collateral. Dante looked down at her, his face a mask of stone, but something shifted in his eyes. A flicker of dark amusement. You're walking out those doors with me, Sloane. The only variable is whether you do it on your own 2 feet, or slung over my shoulder in front of the governor. Choose. He knew her name. He knew exactly who was in the room. This wasn't a random seizure of assets. It was targeted. Sloane looked at her father one last time. Richard was already turning back to the crowd, raising his hands, pasting a weak, shaking smile on his face as he tried to usher the musicians back to their seats. The transaction was over. She was already gone in his mind, the fight drained out of her, replaced by a cold, hollow cynicism. If this was all she meant to them, there was nothing left to fight for here. Let go of my arm, she said quietly. Dante released her instantly. He gestured towards the door. Sloane kept her chin high. She didn't look at Paige. She didn't look at the guests who were whispering behind their hands. She walked down the center of the ballroom, her awful seafoam green dress rustling against the floorboards. Dante walked a step behind her, his men falling in line to form a protective, impenetrable wall around them. The heavy mahogany doors closed behind them, muffling the sudden explosion of chaotic chatter from the ballroom. The November air hit her like a physical blow as they stepped out of the Belmont Hotel onto the damp pavement. A fleet of sleek, black SUVs sat idling at the curb, their exhaust forming white clouds in the streetlights. One of Dante's men opened the back door of the lead vehicle. Dante gestured for her to get in. Sloane slid into the leather interior. It smelled like expensive cologne and ozone. Dante slid in next to her, filling the space, sucking the oxygen from the air. The door slammed shut, sealing them in a quiet, armored bubble. The convoy pulled away from the curb smoothly. Sloane stared out the tinted window, watching the glowing facade of the Belmont disappear into the night. Her hands were shaking so violently she had to clasp them together in her lap. The reality of what had just happened was crashing down on her. She was in a car with the head of the city's most ruthless crime syndicate. She belonged to him now. "Why me?" she asked. The silence in the car was too heavy, too thick. She needed to puncture it. Dante was staring out the opposite window. He didn't turn his head when he answered. "Because your father values his reputation more than his blood," Dante said quietly, his deep voice vibrating in the confined space. "And because I despise men who throw away things they don't understand the worth of." He finally turned to look at her. The streetlights flickered across his face, illuminating the sharp angles and the cold, grey eyes. "You're done playing the forgotten daughter, Sloane. From tonight on, you don't belong to the Hayes family." He leaned back against the leather seat, the shadows swallowing his expression. "You belong to me." The drive lasted a little over an hour, but the silence inside the armored SUV made it stretch into a quiet eternity. Sloane watched the city's glowing skyline recede in the side mirror, replaced gradually by the pitch-black stretches of the northern highway. And finally, the dense, winding roads of the hills. The transition from the glittering, artificial world of the Belmont Hotel to the absolute darkness of the countryside felt like crossing the river Styx. She had left the land of the living, or at least the land of the comfortably ignorant. Dante didn't speak. He spent the journey scrolling through a tablet, his face bathed in its cold blue light. He didn't offer reassurances. He didn't issue threats. His indifference was more terrifying than a weapon. It communicated exactly how little effort it took to control her life. The convoy slowed, the tires crunching over a gravel transition. Sloane leaned closer to the tinted glass. Heavy steel gates materialized out of the darkness, illuminated by harsh, high-lumen floodlights. There was no ornate crest, no wrought-iron flourishes to announce wealth. It looked like the entrance to a private military installation. Two men in dark, tactical gear stepped out of a reinforced guardhouse. They didn't wave the vehicles through with lazy familiarity. They conducted a systematic sweep, mirrors on poles sliding under the chassis, heavy flashlights cutting across the interior of the driver's cabin. Only when the lead guard tapped the hood twice did the massive steel gates slide open on silent tracks. The estate itself sat at the end of a long, curving driveway flanked by old-growth pines. It was a sprawling, brutalist structure of concrete, dark wood, and massive panes of reinforced glass. It didn't look like a home. It looked like a fortress pretending to be a modern architectural marvel. The SUV stopped beneath a deep, cantilevered portico. Dante's door opened before he even reached for the handle. He stepped out and turned, waiting. He didn't offer his hand. Sloane appreciated that. She didn't want his courtesy. She wanted her bearings. She slid across the leather seat and stepped onto the slate driveway. The November chill bit instantly into her bare shoulders. She crossed her arms over her chest, the seafoam green silk of her bridesmaid dress feeling absurdly thin and entirely out of place against the stark, militaristic efficiency of her surroundings. "Inside," Dante said. It was the first word he had spoken since they left the city. Sloane followed him through the heavy front doors. The interior was cavernous, minimalist, and deeply unwelcoming. The floors were polished dark stone that echoed with every step. The walls were mostly bare, save for a few large, abstract paintings that looked more like violent brushstrokes than art. Before she could process the layout, a low, rumbling growl vibrated through the entryway. Sloane froze. From the shadows of the adjacent hallway, a massive German shepherd stepped into the light. It wasn't a family pet. It had the lean, heavily muscled build of a working line dog, straight back, deep chest, and eyes that were entirely devoid of playfulness. Its black and tan coat bristled slightly. It didn't bark. It stood perfectly still, its eyes locked dead on Sloane, assessing her as a threat variable rather than a guest. The dog moved with predatory silence, closing the distance until it was 5 feet away. It stopped, dropping its weight slightly into a poised, coiled stance, ready to launch. Panic flared in Sloane's throat, but she forced herself to remain completely still. Running would trigger a prey drive. She knew that much. Dante didn't raise his voice. He didn't even look fully at the animal. He simply raised his right hand, keeping his fingers flat, and made a single, sharp, downward motion. Down! The command was spoken in German, quiet and absolute. Platz. The shepherd dropped immediately. Its elbows hit the stone floor without hesitation, its chin resting flat against its paws. The aggression didn't leave its eyes, but its body was entirely subjugated to Dante's silent authority. The level of training was impeccable, speaking to thousands of hours of specialized tactical conditioning. "His name is Atlas," Dante said, stepping past the dog without giving it a second glance. "He's been trained to apprehend intruders. If you try to leave the perimeter of the house at night without me, he will stop you. It won't be gentle. Do you understand?" "Loud and clear," Sloane managed to say, her voice tight. Dante nodded once. "Your room is up the stairs, second door on the left. No one will disturb you. Get some sleep." He turned and walked down a long corridor, disappearing into the shadows. The dog remained on the floor, its dark eyes watching Sloane's every breath. She didn't wait. She turned and walked up the floating glass and steel staircase, her legs trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion. She found the second door on the left and pushed it open. The bedroom was vast and impersonal. A king-sized bed dominated the center, covered in dark grey linens. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over a sprawling, blacked-out landscape. There were no bars on the windows, but she knew she was as trapped here as if she were in a cell. Sloane walked into the adjoining bathroom. She stared at herself in the wide, illuminated mirror. Her elaborate updo was falling apart, pins digging into her scalp. Her mascara had smudged slightly, and her pale skin looked sickly against the awful green fabric of her dress. She systematically dismantled her appearance. She pulled the pins from her hair, letting the heavy brown strands fall over her shoulders. She reached around her back and unzipped the bridesmaid dress, letting the expensive, restrictive garment pool at her feet on the heated tile floor. There was a heavy terry-cloth robe hanging on the back of the door. She wrapped herself in it, tying the belt tightly around her waist. She walked back into the bedroom, ignoring the massive bed, and sat on the edge of a leather chaise lounge near the window. She stared out into the darkness. She didn't cry. The tears simply weren't there. Instead, a cold, heavy cynicism settled into her bones. Her father had traded her to balance a ledger. She was a line item crossed out in red ink. She pulled her knees to her chest. She was entirely alone, guarded by men with guns and a dog bred for violence, owned by a man who ruled the city's underworld. And yet, as she closed her eyes, the darkest, most terrifying thought crept into the back of her mind. "I don't think I miss my family at all." Sloane woke with a sharp gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs. For a terrifying 3 seconds, she didn't know where she was. The ceiling was concrete, the walls were expansive glass, and the bed beneath her was entirely too large. Then the memory of the wedding, the cold ballroom, and Dante Valenti's glacial eyes came rushing back like a physical weight pressing down on her chest. She sat up. Sunlight was pouring through the massive windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The clock on the nightstand read 9:45 a.m. Her mouth tasted like stale champagne and exhaustion. She forced herself out of bed, her muscles protesting. The adrenaline of the previous night had completely faded, leaving behind a deep, aching soreness. She walked to the large walk-in closet attached to the room, expecting it to be empty. Instead, she found a row of basic, neutral clothing hung neatly on the racks. Sweaters, soft cotton t-shirts, dark denim jeans. The tags were still on them, and they were all her exact size. It wasn't a romantic gesture, it was terrifyingly efficient logistics. Someone in Dante's organization had sourced her measurements and stocked the room before she had even been taken from the hotel. She chose a thick black turtleneck sweater and a pair of jeans. They felt like armor compared to the fragile silk of last night. Sloane opened her bedroom door cautiously. The hallway was empty. The house was utterly silent, devoid of the usual domestic hum of televisions, conversation, or clattering dishes. It felt like walking through a museum after hours. She descended the floating staircase, her bare feet silent on the cold stone. She followed the faint, rich scent of dark roast coffee through the cavernous living area and into a sleek, industrial kitchen. A stainless steel carafe sat on the granite island, alongside a single white mug. Beside the mug was a folded piece of paper. Sloane approached it slowly. She poured the coffee. It was hot and painfully bitter, exactly what she needed, and picked up the note. "My office, end of the East Wing." It wasn't a request. She drank half the coffee in 2 long swallows, letting the heat burn away the lingering fog in her brain. Then she walked out of the kitchen, navigating the stark, sunlit corridors toward the East Wing. She found the office easily. The double oak doors were slightly ajar. She pushed them open. If the rest of the house was a fortress, this room was the command center. It didn't look like the lair of a street thug. It looked like the office of a Fortune 500 CEO. 3 massive monitors dominated a large glass desk, displaying shifting graphs, logistical tracking software, and live security feeds. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with thick volumes on international trade law, maritime logistics, and corporate tax structuring. Dante sat behind the desk. He wore a crisp white dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing forearms corded with muscle and faintly dusted with dark hair. He was speaking quietly into a headset, his eyes tracking data on the center monitor. He glanced up as Sloane entered, held up a single finger, and finished his sentence. "Reroute the containers through the secondary port in New Jersey. Pay the union reps their penalty fee, but make sure the cargo isn't flagged." "Yes, done." He tapped a button on the keyboard and removed the headset, tossing it onto the desk. He leaned back in his chair, studying her. The grey eyes were just as flat and assessing in the morning light as they had been in the shadows of the ballroom. "Sit," he said, gesturing to one of the leather chairs opposite his desk. Sloane walked forward, keeping her spine rigid. She sat down, clutching her coffee mug with both hands to keep them from shaking. "Is this the part where you outline my duties as a hostage?" Dante didn't smile, but a muscle feathered in his jaw. "You aren't a hostage. Hostages have ransom demands. No one is paying to get you back." The words were brutally honest. They stung, a sharp slap of reality, but Sloane refused to let him see her flinch. "Then what am I? A trophy to humiliate my father?" "Humiliating your father is a byproduct. It isn't the objective." Dante leaned forward, opening a heavy, leather-bound folder on his desk. He turned it around and slid it across the glass surface toward her. "Read it." Sloane looked at the folder. She hesitated for a second before reaching out. She opened the cover. Inside were copies of corporate ledgers, shipping manifests, and bank transfer records. It took her only a few seconds to recognize the letterhead. Hayes Logistics, her father's company. The company that had funded the Belmont Hotel wedding, the custom silk gown, the diamond tie tax. She flipped through the pages. The columns of numbers were dense, but she had spent 4 years archiving municipal records and auditing city files. She knew how to read a spreadsheet. "I don't understand," she said, her brow furrowing. "These are cargo manifests, mostly agricultural machinery and industrial recovery rigs coming in from Eastern Europe. It's boring, but it's legal. Look at the routing numbers on the secondary pages," Dante instructed, his voice low and devoid of inflection. "Look at the subsidiary companies handling the final delivery." Sloane turned the page. She traced her finger down the list of subsidiaries. Her breath caught in her throat. "Apex Archival Solutions. That's—" She looked up at Dante, the blood draining from her face. "That's a shell company. It doesn't exist. It exists on paper." Dante corrected softly. It exists entirely for the purpose of receiving undocumented cargo, specifically untaxed firearms and illicit pharmaceuticals, bypassing customs under the guise of heavy machinery parts and laundering the proceeds. Sloane stared at the documents, a sickening realization blooming in her stomach. My father was using his company to smuggle for the syndicate. For me, Dante clarified. Yes, it was a lucrative arrangement. The ports are heavily monitored, but heavy agricultural equipment takes a massive amount of specialized logistics to move. It's the perfect cover. The crates are too large, the X-rays are complicated, and the paperwork is a nightmare. Your father provided the infrastructure. So why did you crash the wedding? If he was making you money. Because Richard got greedy, Dante said, his voice hardening slightly. 3 months ago, a shipment went missing. He claimed customs seized it. I had my people audit the docks. Customs didn't seize anything. Your father sold my cargo to a rival outfit in Chicago, pocketed the cash, and tried to cook the books to hide the loss. He thought I wouldn't notice a $3 million deficit buried in tractor parts. Sloane felt a sharp wave of nausea. Her father wasn't just a corrupt businessman, he was an idiot playing games with violent men. So he owed you $3 million? No, Dante said. He reached across the desk and tapped a specific document near the back of the folder. Read the incorporation papers for the shell company, Apex Archival Solutions. Sloane flipped to the back. She scanned the dense legal jargon, looking for the officers of the company. When she found the line detailing the chief executive officer and sole primary shareholder, the room seemed to tilt violently on its axis. There, printed in bold, undeniable ink, was her name. Sloane Hayes. Beneath it was a signature. It was forged, but it was a masterful forgery. It looked exactly like the way she signed her checks. The air was sucked out of her lungs. The coffee mug in her hands rattled against the glass desk as she set it down. He put it in my name, she whispered, the words scraping against her throat. He didn't just owe me money, Sloane, Dante said, his gaze locked onto her face, watching her process the betrayal. When the federal authorities inevitably caught wind of the missing cargo and started digging into the tax discrepancies, the trail wouldn't have led to Richard Hayes. It would have bypassed him entirely. The paper trail was engineered to lead directly to you. Sloane couldn't speak. She stared at her own forged signature. Her father hadn't just sold her to a Mafia boss to save his company. He had actively framed her for federal crimes to save himself from prison. He had built a trap door, pushed her onto it, and kept his hand on the lever. The feds have been building a RICO case for 6 months, Dante continued smoothly. They were going to raid your apartment on Monday. You would have been indicted for international smuggling, tax evasion, and wire fraud. With the evidence your father meticulously planted, you would have faced 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Minimum. Sloane slowly lifted her eyes from the folder. The cynicism that had armored her the night before cracked, shattered by the sheer, breathtaking malice of her own blood. Why are you showing me this? She asked, her voice dangerously quiet. If I'm the fall guy, why not just let the feds take me? It solves your problem. My father goes down eventually, or he keeps working for you in debt. Dante closed the folder and pulled it back across the desk. Because I don't believe in waste, Dante said. And I don't let other men handle my betrayals. Your father thought he could steal from me and offer up his forgotten daughter as a sacrificial lamb to the government to cover his tracks. He thought I was a blunt instrument. Dante leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the desk. By taking you in front of 400 witnesses, I publicly shattered his reputation. He is tied to me now in the eyes of the city's elite. The merger with Carter's family will collapse by noon today. His stock will plummet. And the federal indictment? Sloane asked, her mind racing, struggling to keep up with the layered violence of corporate warfare. I had my people scrub the municipal servers at 3 a.m. We transferred the ownership of the shell company back to your father. The forged documents in your apartment were removed. Dante's eyes narrowed slightly. You are clean, Sloane. You belong to me now, but you are out of the government's crosshairs. Sloane sat back in her chair. The sheer magnitude of the manipulation was staggering. Dante hadn't kidnapped her out of sudden, dark lust. He had executed a hostile corporate takeover of her life to destroy her father. She was a chess piece, but for the first time in her life, she was a piece that had been protected, rather than sacrificed. So, Sloane said, a dry, bitter laugh escaping her lips. I'm not a hostage, I'm a tax loophole. Dante didn't laugh, but the harsh lines around his mouth softened marginally. You are a complication that I chose to inherit. How you handle that is up to you. The rest of the day was a masterclass in psychological isolation. Sloane didn't see Dante again after she left his office. She was free to roam the interior of the Haubia, but she quickly discovered the parameters of her freedom. The front doors were locked via a biometric keypad. The massive glass doors leading to the back terrace were equally sealed. When she stood by the windows looking out over the expansive, meticulously manicured grounds, she saw men patrolling in pairs, and she saw Atlas. The German shepherd stalked the perimeter line with terrifying, tireless focus. He never seemed to stop moving, a dark shadow cutting through the frost-covered grass. She spent the afternoon in the estate's library. It was a massive room, smelling of old paper and wood polish, clearly designed for someone who actually read, rather than someone who bought books by the yard for aesthetics. She found a section on municipal history and buried herself in it, desperate for the familiar comfort of archival facts to drown out the noise in her head. Her father had framed her. She read a paragraph on the 1920s zoning laws 4 times without retaining a single word. She had always known her family was toxic. She knew Paige was self-absorbed and Richard was ruthless. But framing her for a federal crime, 20 years in prison, anger, pure and white-hot, finally began to burn away the numbness. She didn't want to cry anymore. She wanted to burn Hayes Logistics to the ground. At 7:30 p.m., a quiet knock sounded at the library door. An older woman with iron grey hair, pulled back in a severe bun, stepped into the room. She wore a simple grey dress and sensible shoes. Dinner is served in the formal dining room, Miss Hayes, the woman said. Her accent was thick, Eastern European. She didn't smile. Just Sloane, please, she replied, closing the book. The woman gave a curt nod. Mr. Valenti is waiting. Sloane stood up, smoothing down the front of her black turtleneck. She wasn't going to cower. She was a captive, yes, but Dante had shown his hand. He needed her to be the living embodiment of her father's failure. She had value. She followed the housekeeper down the long corridors to the dining room. It was a long, narrow space, dominated by a massive, raw-edge walnut table that could easily seat 20 people. Only 2 settings were laid out, one at the head of the table and one immediately to the right. Dante was already seated at the head. He had shed the suit jacket and tie, but he still wore the white dress shirt, the collar undone. He looked less like a CEO now and more like a man who was dangerous in a physical, immediate way. He didn't stand when she entered, but he nodded to the chair beside him. Sloane sat. The proximity was deliberate. He could have seated her at the opposite end of the massive table, maintaining a cold distance. Sitting her right next to him forced an intimacy that made the air feel thick. A server appeared silently, placing bowls of dark, rich risotto in front of them, followed by heavy crystal glasses of red wine. Dante picked up his fork. He didn't wait for pleasantries. Sloane didn't touch her food. She looked at him. Up close, the scar through his eyebrow was more prominent. It looked old, a jagged testament to a violent past that preceded his time in boardrooms and tailored suits. Are you planning to starve yourself as a form of protest? Dante asked, not looking up from his plate. It's entirely ineffective. I'm not protesting, Sloane said. Her voice was steady. I'm trying to figure out the logistics of my new life. If I'm not a hostage, and I'm not going to prison, what exactly am I supposed to do here all day? Read about zoning laws while your attack dog patrols the yard? Dante took a slow sip of his wine. He finally turned his head to look at her. The glacial grey of his eyes caught the dim light of the dining room chandelier. "You are going to untangle the mess your father made," Dante said. Sloane blinked. "Excuse me?" "Richard Hayes is a sloppy man," Dante said, setting his glass down. "He didn't just cook the books on the Apex Shell Company. When my auditors began digging today, they found irregularities across his entire logistics network. He's been skimming from the unions, misreporting tonnage on the barges, and bribing the wrong municipal clerks. He's a liability." "And what does that have to do with me?" "You spent 4 years working in the city archives," Dante said. He knew her resume. Of course he did. "You understand municipal routing, tax variances, and logistical reporting better than anyone in my organization. You know how the city tracks its cargo." Sloane stared at him, genuinely stunned. "You kidnapped me to do your accounting?" A flicker of genuine amusement crossed Dante's face, entirely altering his harsh features for a split second. "I took you to cripple your father, but I keep you because you possess a highly specific skill set that I currently require. I need someone to rebuild the logistics network from the inside out. Someone who knows where Richard buried the bodies, so to speak." "Why would I help you?" Sloane demanded, leaning back in her chair. "You're a criminal. You run a syndicate. You extort, you smuggle, and you threaten people. Why would I apply my skills to make your cartel run more efficiently?" Dante didn't raise his voice, but the sudden intensity in his gaze pinned her to the back of her chair. "Because the alternative is watching the Hayes family empire, and hundreds of innocent dock workers and drivers who rely on it, collapse under federal indictments and gang violence," Dante said softly, leaning closer to her. "I am a criminal, Sloane. I don't pretend otherwise. I operate in the dark because the light is crowded with hypocrites like your father." He pointed a finger at her. "Your father wears a tuxedo and shakes hands with the governor while framing his own daughter to save his skin. I run an organization that relies on loyalty, precision, and absolute accountability. I don't betray my own." The words hit her like a physical blow. The sheer twisted logic of it was undeniable. Dante Valenti was a violent man, a dangerous man, but he wasn't a hypocrite. He dealt in brutal truths. Her family dealt in beautiful lies. "You want me to audit the man who sold me?" Sloane said slowly, the concept taking root in her mind. "I want you to dismantle his safety nets," Dante corrected. "I want you to find every hidden account, every falsified manifest, every bribe. You will map it all out for me. And when you are done, Richard Hayes will have nothing left to leverage. He will be entirely at my mercy." Sloane looked down at her untouched food, then back up at Dante. For the first time since the mahogany doors of the ballroom had slammed open, she didn't feel like a victim. She felt dangerous. She picked up her fork. She took a slow, deliberate bite of the risotto. It was exceptional. She swallowed, met Dante's cold, grey eyes, and offered him a cynical, humorless smile. "I need 2 more monitors in that office," Sloane said, "and access to the city's secure municipal intranet." Dante watched her for a long, quiet moment. The tension in the room didn't dissipate. It shifted, transforming from the heavy dread of captivity into the crackling electricity of a dangerous partnership. "Done," Dante said. He raised his glass of wine toward her in a silent toast. Sloane picked up her own glass. The crystal chimed softly as they met in the space between them. A pact made in the dark, forged in the ashes of a family's betrayal. The East Wing office became her sanctuary. For the next 3 weeks, the massive glass desk was a war zone of municipal routing codes, offshore shell company ledgers, and cold coffee. Dante had kept his word. The morning after their dinner, 2 additional high-resolution monitors were installed on the desk. By noon, she had a secure, encrypted uplink to the city's municipal intranet. She didn't ask how he bypassed the government firewalls. She didn't want to know. Sloane worked with a methodical, cold detachment. The grief of her father's betrayal had burned off, leaving behind a sharp, crystalline focus. She wasn't just auditing Hayes' logistics. She was performing an autopsy on a living patient. She tracked the discrepancies. Richard was sloppy. He used a rudimentary mirroring technique, funneling legitimate union dues into a slush fund through a dummy trucking subsidiary out of Delaware. He was double-billing the city for municipal waste removal on the docks, padding the payload weights with scrap metal, and skimming the difference to pay off a state inspector. Every lie he told, every corner he cut, Sloane found it. She highlighted it in red on the master spreadsheet she was building for Dante. She wasn't entirely alone in the office. Atlas, the massive German shepherd, had taken up a permanent post beneath the glass desk. It started on day 3. Sloane had been staring at a particularly convoluted tax variance for 6 hours, rubbing her temples, when the dog nudged the door open with his heavy snout. He didn't seek affection. He walked into the room with his usual predatory silence, did a visual sweep of the corners, and then circled twice before dropping his 70-pound frame directly onto her feet. Sloane had frozen, remembering the coiled aggression of their first meeting. But Atlas just let out a long, heavy sigh and closed his eyes. From then on, he was a fixture. He provided a grounded physical weight that tethered her to reality when the numbers blurred together. She learned his subtle cues. A low, barely audible rumble in his chest meant someone was walking down the hall. A twitch of his right ear meant Dante was approaching. Dante was a constant, brooding presence. He didn't hover, but he observed. He would stand by the floor-to-ceiling windows, a glass of dark amber whiskey in his hand, listening to the rain lash against the glass while she typed. Their conversations were brief, clipped, and entirely transactional. "He moved $300,000 through a Cayman account on Tuesday," Sloane said one evening, not taking her eyes off the center monitor. "It's a panic move. He knows someone is inside the system. He's trying to liquidate the liquid assets before they're frozen." Dante walked over. He stood behind her chair. He was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off his body, smelling the familiar blend of bergamot and gun oil. He leaned down, bracing one hand on the desk, his face inches from hers as he read the screen. "Can you intercept the wire?" he asked. His voice was a low rumble by her ear. "Already did," Sloane replied, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "I routed it through a holding company you own in Panama. The funds will bounce in a holding pattern for 48 hours and then deposit into your primary syndicate ledger. Richard's account will show a systemic error code." Dante was silent for a long moment. Sloane stopped typing. She turned her head slightly. His grey eyes were locked on her profile. The flat, dead look was gone. It was replaced by something sharp, assessing, and deeply dangerous. It was the look of a man who had expected a pawn and discovered a queen. "You are ruthless, Sloane," he said quietly. "I had a good teacher," she replied, holding his gaze. "My father taught me that blood doesn't matter, only the bottom line." Dante's jaw tightened. He reached out, his knuckles grazing the skin of her neck, just below her ear. The touch was electric, a stark contrast to the sterile environment of data and screens. "I am not your father," Dante said, his voice dropping an octave. "And you don't belong to him anymore." He pulled his hand back, straightening up. "Finish the routing. Tomorrow, we bring him in." Sloane turned back to the monitors, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She hit the execute key. The transfer was complete. Richard Hayes was officially bankrupt. It rained the next morning. A cold, driving sleet that turned the estate's sprawling lawns into a slick, grey wasteland. Sloane sat at the glass desk. The master spreadsheet was open on the center monitor. It was a masterpiece of financial destruction, 1,000 lines of data detailing exactly how a titan of industry had cannibalized his own empire. The heavy oak doors of the office opened. 2 of Dante's men stepped inside. They were massive, wearing tailored suits that barely concealed the tactical vests beneath. Between them stood Richard Hayes, Sloane felt a momentary jolt of adrenaline, but it vanished instantly, replaced by a profound, hollow disgust. Her father looked like a ghost. He had aged 10 years in 3 weeks. His custom suit hung loosely on his frame. The arrogant, booming patriarch who had orchestrated a high society wedding and sold his daughter for a tax loophole was gone. He looked frantic. He looked small. Dante walked in behind them. He didn't wear a suit today. He wore a black combat sweater and dark cargo pants. He looked like exactly what he was, a warlord in his own fortress. Dante gestured to the 2 guards. They stepped back, leaving Richard standing in the center of the room. Atlas, sleeping under the desk, let out a low, vibrating growl. Sloane tapped her heel lightly against the dog's ribs, a silent command. The growl ceased, but Atlas remained rigid, his dark eyes locked on Richard. Richard looked around the office, his eyes finally landing on Sloane. Relief washed over his pale face. It was a sickening, manipulative expression. "Sloane," Richard breathed, taking a step forward. "Thank God. I've been trying to find out where he took you. The police. I couldn't go to the police. The merger collapsed. Carter's family backed out. The press is circling. It's been a nightmare." He reached out his hands, palms up, playing the role of the desperate father. "Are you hurt? Did he touch you? We can fix this. I have a plane waiting at Teterboro. We can leave the country today." Sloane didn't move. She leaned back in the ergonomic leather chair, interlacing her fingers in her lap. She let the silence stretch, letting him drown in it. "A plane," Sloane repeated, her voice deadpan. "Funded by which account, Richard? The Cayman account I intercepted yesterday? Or the Delaware slush fund I drained on Tuesday?" Richard froze. His hands dropped to his sides. The mask of paternal concern cracked, revealing the raw, panicked calculation underneath. "What are you talking about?" Sloane tapped the spacebar on her keyboard. The massive monitor mounted on the wall behind her flared to life, mirroring her center screen. The spreadsheet illuminated the dark room. "It took me exactly 3 weeks to dismantle your life," Sloane said, her voice echoing off the concrete walls. "You left a paper trail a mile wide, the bribes to the state inspectors, the phantom shipments of agricultural machinery, the union kickbacks." She stood up. She didn't wear a bridesmaid dress today. She wore a tailored black blazer and dark jeans. She looked like she belonged in this room. "You thought you were a mastermind," she continued, walking slowly around the edge of the glass desk. "You thought you could steal from a syndicate, frame your youngest daughter for federal racketeering, and walk away with your reputation intact." Richard's mouth opened and closed, no sound coming out. He looked at the screen, recognizing the damning columns of his own financial treason. He turned to Dante. "Valenti, please. She doesn't know what she's looking at. She's just a clerk. She is the architect of your ruin." Dante corrected smoothly. He walked over to Sloane, coming to a stop just behind her right shoulder. The physical proximity was a deliberate show of force, a unified front. "Every dollar you stole from me has been repossessed. Every illicit contract you held has been nullified. You have 0 liquid assets. Your properties are highly leveraged, and the banks will call in the loans by 5 o'clock today." "You can't do this!" Richard yelled, his voice cracking, the panic finally breaking through. "I built Hayes Logistics from the ground up. It's my life. I'll go to the feds. I'll testify against you, Valenti. I'll burn your whole syndicate to the ground." Dante didn't even blink. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope, and tossed it onto the desk. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud. "That envelope contains the forged incorporation papers for Apex Archival Solutions," Dante said quietly. "The ones you signed with your daughter's name. It also contains the unredacted audio recordings of you bribing a customs official and a signed affidavit from your chief financial officer, who was very eager to cooperate with my men last night." Richard stared at the envelope as if it were a live grenade. "You aren't going to the feds," Dante said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "Because if you walk into a federal building, that envelope arrives at the district attorney's office 10 minutes later. You won't get witness protection, Richard. You'll get a 20-year sentence in a maximum security facility, and you will carry a jacket that labels you a rat. You wouldn't survive the first week." Richard's legs gave out. He collapsed into one of the leather guest chairs, burying his face in his hands. A harsh, pathetic sob echoed in the quiet room. Sloane looked down at the man who had raised her. She expected to feel a sense of triumph, a rush of vindication. Instead, she felt absolutely nothing. The man crying in the chair was a stranger, a pathetic, hollow shell of a human being who only cared about himself. "What do you want?" Richard whispered through his hands, utterly broken. Sloane looked at Dante. Dante gave her a single subtle nod. The execution was hers to finalize. "You're going to walk out of this house," Sloane said. "You're going to go back to the city. You will file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in the morning. You will surrender the remaining assets of Hayes Logistics to a holding company of Mr. Valenti's choosing. Then you and Paige are going to pack whatever you can fit into a single car, and you are going to leave the state." Richard slowly lowered his hands. His eyes were red-rimmed and bloodshot. "Leave? To where?" "I don't care," Sloane said coldly. "But if you ever set foot in this city again, if you ever attempt to contact me, or if you ever say the name Valenti out loud, the envelope goes to the DA. Are we clear?" Richard looked at her. Really looked at her. He saw the cold, unyielding grey in her eyes, a reflection of the man standing behind her. He swallowed hard and gave a single, jerky nod. "Guards," Dante said. The two massive men stepped forward, hauling Richard out of the chair by his armpits. They didn't speak. They simply dragged him out of the office, the heavy oak doors swinging shut behind them. The silence that followed was absolute. Sloane stood perfectly still for a long time. She stared at the closed oak doors. The phantom weight of her past, a weight she hadn't even realized she was carrying, suddenly lifted off her shoulders. It was over. She was free. She felt a warm, heavy weight against her leg. Atlas had crawled out from under the desk and pressed his large head against her thigh. She reached down, threading her fingers through the thick, coarse fur behind his ears. "You did well," Dante said. Sloane turned around. Dante was watching her. The lethal, commanding warlord from a moment ago was gone, replaced by a quiet, intense focus. He stepped closer, entering her space. "He deserved worse," Dante added, his voice low. "I would have put a bullet in his head and buried him in the foundation if you had asked. Death is too easy for men like him." Sloane replied, her voice steady. "Let him live in a cheap apartment somewhere in Ohio, remembering what it felt like to be important. That's a real punishment." A slow, dark smile curved Dante's lips. It was a rare, genuine expression that transformed his face, making him look breathtakingly handsome in a brutal, rugged way. "You are terrifying, Sloane." "I adapted," she said. She looked up at him, meeting his glacial eyes. She didn't look away. The fear that had defined their first encounter in the ballroom was completely gone. In its place was a heavy, magnetic pull, a recognition. "So," Sloane said, taking a small step forward. The space between them evaporated. "The debt is settled. The ledger is clear. My father is gone. He is. Which means I have no leverage over you, and you have no leverage over me." She continued, her chin tilting up. "I'm not a hostage. I'm not a tax loophole." "No," Dante agreed quietly. "So why am I still here?" Dante didn't answer with words. He reached out, his large hands framing her face. His palms were rough, calloused from years of violence, but his touch was incredibly precise. He traced the line of her jaw with his thumbs. "Because you belong here," he said, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. "You belong in the dark, with me. You belong running this empire, dismantling my enemies, and sleeping in my bed." He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. His breath was warm against her skin. "I told you the first night. Mine. It wasn't a claim of ownership, Sloane. It was a recognition. I saw you in that ballroom, suffocating in a world of plastic smiles and weak men. I saw what you really were. Sloane closed her eyes. The scent of bergamot and rain washed over her. She had spent her entire life trying to shrink, trying to fit into a mold her family had constructed for her. Dante hadn't broken the mold. He had handed her a sledgehammer and watched her smash it herself. She didn't want a normal life. She didn't want a safe, quiet job archiving records for a city that didn't care about her. She wanted the power. She wanted the danger. She wanted the man standing in front of her. Sloane reached up, her hands gripping the thick wool of his combat sweater. She pulled him down. The kiss wasn't gentle. It was a collision. It was hungry, desperate, and entirely consuming. Dante groaned, a harsh, guttural sound, his arms wrapping around her waist and lifting her off the floor, pressing her back against the edge of the glass desk. She tangled her fingers in his dark hair, kissing him back with a ferocity that surprised them both. It was a release of 3 weeks of tension, of fear, of cold, calculating rage. He tasted like expensive whiskey and absolute power. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing heavily. Dante kept his arms locked around her waist, keeping her elevated against the desk, his grey eyes burning into hers. "You stay," he commanded. It wasn't a threat. It was a plea, disguised as an order. Sloane looked over his shoulder at the glowing monitors, the master spreadsheet, the empire they were going to rebuild together. Then she looked down at Atlas, who was lying patiently on the floor, waiting for them to finish. She looked back at the Mafia boss holding her. A cynical, brilliant smile crossed her lips. "I'll stay," Sloane said, her voice a soft, lethal promise. "But I'm renegotiating my contract. I want a corner office." Dante laughed, a deep, rich sound that filled the concrete room. He pulled her back in for another kiss. Sloane Hayes was dead. The forgotten daughter was gone. She had stepped out of the shadow of a corrupt family and walked willingly into the arms of the underworld. She didn't just survive the Mafia boss who claimed her. She was going to rule beside him. Sloane didn't just survive Dante Valenti. She became the architect of his empire. From a forgotten daughter sold to settle a debt, she turned the tables, ruined the father who betrayed her, and claimed the crown of the underworld. The chemistry, the betrayal, and the cold, hard justice make this a Mafia romance you won't forget. If you loved watching Sloane step into her power and embrace the dark, don't leave without supporting the channel. Like this video, share it with your fellow dark romance readers, and subscribe for more intense, gritty stories every single week.